Hey girls, so I thought that I would do a little bit of an editing session for you, and these are some photos from a brand photo shoot I did with the lovely Courtney. So I'm just gonna go through and show you how I'm gonna edit these. So basically, I always start with my super basic sliders here. Don't want too much contrast in that photo. So on this day it was quite harsh, the sunlight, so we want to kind of take that down a little bit. There's a little bit of overexposed light. Up the clarity a tiny bit. Because it's got that real summery vibe, I kind of want to up the vibrance just to really bring out those colors. And I might just crop this, get that shop sign out of the way. And I'm just going to have a bit of a play with my tone curve as well. Sometimes I use the curve here, other times I don't. It really depends on how I'm feeling on the day. On a lot of my photos, I really love to bring up the darkness, just because I don't love the photos to be too dark, and just bring down those shadows a tiny little bit. Bump that up a little bit more. So as you can see, like, we've really removed some of that harshness. I think it actually looks a little bit too vibrant, to be honest. So I'm just going to bring down the saturation. Actually, let's bring down the vibrance again. This is a little bit too in your face. But we'll really soften some of those shadows. Just might bring that exposure down a tiny bit. That looks pretty good. Now, the other thing that I do love to play with is the RGB curve. So I like to go through these individually. Now you've got your highlights, your midtones, and your shadows. So it really depends on the kind of look you're going for. Now, given this is a bit of a summery vibe, we want to put a little bit more warmth into this. Put a little bit into the midtones there. And a little bit in the shadows. Oh, I might go to the blues here because I've got a little bit of blue that I'd like to take out. And really it's just all about playing with it and seeing what looks good for your photo. I'm going to add a little bit of a cool tone in there in the highlights. Bring down those blues in the mid-tones. Just bring that up in the shadows. I think that looks pretty okay. Now, often as well, I do play around with the hue, the saturation, and the luminance. For this photo, I'm actually pretty happy with the colors. Usually, if I am adjusting anything, it's going to be the blues with the saturation. So we might bring those down a little bit, as well as the greens, just because they look a little bit too bright. And I think that looks pretty good. So really like softened up those shadows, and toned down a little bit of that color, but evened it out as well. Now I've got roughly the same kind of photo here with those that harsher sunlight. Now what you can do is actually just hit copy on your keyboard, and you can paste to see if your edits still look okay on the next image. So I actually think that looks pretty good, but it's a little bit too bright. I'm just going to bring that down a tiny bit with the exposure. Might add a little bit of warmth into it. Give it more of that summery vibe. Just going to down the highlights a little bit. Just going to see what happens when we up the contrast. Might turn it down there. Let's see what that looks like. Might add a little bit more shadows, more of those shadows in. Might up that vibrance. Now there's a little bit of green in here actually, so I'm just going to up that blue to balance that out. Come back down to our HSL colors. Just going to bump down the greens. Actually, let's go aqua. There's a bit of aqua in there. That looks okay. And for this one, I think I'm going to play around with a bit of split toning. So for this one, I kind of either like to have a bit of blue or yellow in the highlights. Not overly saturated. Pink is also a popular color as well that I like to use, but something just very subtle. Maybe there. And for our shadows, you kind of want to usually go on the opposite end of the scale to your highlights and your shadows. So I've got some yellow in my highlights, and I probably want to add in a little bit of, let's see, a little bit of pink in the shadows, but not too overly saturated, just very subtle. So as you can see, we've taken out this little bit of blue aqua here. We've also really warmed up the photo, putting in some yellows and some pinks in the shadows there. So really to give off that summery vibe. Now, again, this one here, it's the same setting. So I'm just going to copy this and paste that onto this one. Now, it doesn't work as well as I'd hoped. So what we're going to do is bring up those shadows. Not overly, but just there looks good. I might turn up that warmth. It's probably a bit too much. Let's go back down to our split toning. So, I mean, for example, if you're buying presets, they're not going to work for every single photo. You're going to have to tweak, you're going to have to experiment with different presets if you do make them. Usually I have a couple of presets over here that I use for my own Instagram account, but I still need to tweak them for pretty much every single one of my photos. So for this, we're just going to bring that down. What do we got here? Let's have a play. It's looking a little green, actually. Just going to get rid of all of that. I'm going to bring down the yellows a little bit. Actually, maybe a lot. Because up here, it's just way too yellow for me. Bring it down all the way. And then we might come up to this blue curve. Have a bit of a play. Might make this a bit of a cooler photo, because I really love those steps and I think they look a little bit better with some cool tones in them. Might just leave that blue curve there. Let's go to our red curve. Oh, too much. So really, like, you're looking for very subtle differences when you're playing around with these curves, but they can literally make all the difference sometimes in your photos. Too much. We want a little bit, maybe there. So let's have a look at what we've got. So I think that's looking pretty good. I really love the cooler tones with the stairs. I think that looks really amazing. And we've also brightened up the shadows on her face as well. So let's move to the next photo. This one I absolutely adore. So we've already got quite a bit of exposure. Might up that contrast a little bit. I'm really into having the highlights down at the moment on all my photos. As you can see, we don't want it too overly exposed, overly highlighted. It just doesn't look as good. So we want that nice even lighting. Bring up a little bit of the shadowing. The whites, bring that up a tiny bit. And I think there is good for the blacks, very subtle. I do like to add a little bit of clarity into each one of my photos. Otherwise, it just looks a bit too washed out if you bring that down too much. And we might just bring down that vibrance a little bit too. That looks good. Actually, it'll bring up a little bit of that saturation. There we go. So I'm gonna go back to my RGB curve and just bring down those highlights here. Bring up the lighting a little bit. I don't want it too light. I think that's looking good. So it's a very subtle difference. Like, this was shot out in natural light. So I don't really need to edit this a whole lot to make it look amazing, because it pretty much already looks amazing, I think. I'll just see what happens when we turn down these yellows. So there's not a lot of yellow in the photo, but we'll leave that there. Let's see, let's have a play with our highlights. Let's maybe put a bit of blue in. So what I like to do is put the saturation up a little bit and have a play with the colors to see what I think will work better for this photo. So we might actually give it some warmth in the highlights. And for the shadows, bring that up a little bit, not too much. We've got a little bit of aqua and green in there. So I think that looks good. But yeah, for this photo, we really don't need to do too much. We've brought down those colors, those harsh colors a little bit, brightened up the photo, just made it a little bit more even. All right, next one. Now, this one is quite harsh. It was, again, quite harsh sunlight. So what I'm gonna do is just bring, actually I wanna leave it there. Just going to bring down that contrast a little bit to even out that photo. I'm going to bring down those highlights just a tiny bit, not too much, because it kind of like makes her skin look a little bit fake. So we're just going to leave it there. Going to up those shadows, turn down the whites a tiny bit, and turn down those blacks a little bit there. Now I'm going to just up the clarity a little bit more than usual, maybe there. I'm not going to play too much around with vibrance. I think probably there is good. Now with our curve, I'm going to bring down that highlight a little bit. I'm not going to put too much light into it because it's already pretty bright. Bring up the darks a little bit and just drop those shadows. So let's have a play around with our color curves. So you want to put 3 dots onto your curve so that you can adjust accordingly. You don't want too much of those reds. So basically you can see where your colors are coming from. So you've got the extreme to the other extreme. So we're going to put a little bit of red in the highlights. Just very, very subtle. Let's go there. Let's go green. Put our dots on. Oh. So, you know what? I'm actually not loving this. I'm just going to undo those curves because I don't love it. There we go. So that already looks better as it is. We don't really need to do too much else to that photo, I don't think. Okay, let's try this one. So as you can see, a lot of these have different, they have different settings, different lighting settings. So for this one, I'm going to bring down that contrast a little bit. Bring down those highlights just a little bit. I like the moodiness of that shadow, so I'm just going to kind of bring that down. I'm going to bring down those blacks as well. That clarity. Okay, what are we working with? Got a bit of yellow. Actually, I want to get rid of that. There's a bit of green there that I don't love. So we're going to get rid of that. The blues, the aquas, really turn that down. Even the yellows as well. There's not really a lot of yellow in that photo. I've also got oranges. So at the moment, again, this photo doesn't need too much done to it because it's shot out in natural light. Everything is already still pretty great. I do need to adjust this a little bit to make it straight. Just come back a little bit this way. Okay. Just up that contrast a little bit actually. Up that shadow a little bit there. So as you can see, girls, like this is all pretty, I'm really just utilizing the basic properties of Lightroom here. When you're feeling ready, go into your tone curves and play around with your red, green and blue individually just to try and get that different effect going. But other than that, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. I would absolutely love that. And I will see you in the next editing video or the next behind the scenes video. Thanks, girls.